Tashidelek, and welcome to In Conversation with Tibettv. In this episode, we have someone who is a longtime friend of Tibet and a renowned international lawyer, a scholar of Tibetan and Inner Asia history, mediator, and advisor in interstate peace processes. He has been a legal advisor of Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama from 1985 to 2011 and Central Tibetan Administration. Currently, he is the Executive President of Kreddha, an international NGO for prevention and resolution of violent interstate conflict. In 2020, he has been awarded the knighthood from the Dutch government in his recognition for his lifelong dedication and commendable achievements in support of unrepresented and oppressed nations and people of the world. He is Dr. Michael van Walt van Praag. Welcome to our show, sir.
Thank you. So nice to be here.
Okay, so Michael, you have been a friend of Tibet for a long time, and you have been a legal advisor to His Holiness and also Central Tibetan Administration. And most importantly, you have also written two very important books on Tibet. Like Sikyongla yesterday during the opening ceremony, he did mention a little bit about your story, how you have your association with the Tibetan community. So going down the memory lane, would you like to tell us how and when this close connection with the Tibetan and Tibetan cause actually happened to you?
Long time ago, as you suggest. It started when I was 11 years old, and I had read a few books about Tibet and tried to read everything I could. There weren't that many books on Tibet in those days, and I felt very bad for what had happened in Tibet. This was around 1962, 63, and so I wrote a letter to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and said that I was going to do something about this, as a child does at that age, with a full conviction that they can do something. Many years later, after having continued to do or to started a number of activities on Tibet and for Tibetan refugee children, I met His Holiness here in Dharamsala 53 years ago, and had an incredible audience with His Holiness, and I think that cemented a relationship which has lasted for my whole life and has most probably also directed and changed my life. As a result of that first meeting and His Holiness's expression of an interest or keen interest in visiting the West, I organized the first visit of His Holiness to the West at his request to 11 countries in Europe in 1973. Yes. Still as a young person of 19. And that was also my first, probably, intensive experience of advocacy.
And Michael, you have written two specific books on Tibet. The first one is Status of Tibet, Rights and Prospect, International Law, which was published in 1987, and which is considered one of the most referred books on Tibet's independence when people need to know about the legal status of Tibet and how Tibet is an independent country. So, and your recent book, which is Tibet Brief 2020, which also both the books compared to talks about history and legal status of Tibet. So, throughout your research and your interest in Tibet cause and our history, what are the specific changes in China's narrative over Tibet and their claim of legitimacy over Tibet for the last 60, 70 years? Or also in your researches in 30 years. So, and how are these changing narratives of Chinese government is actually serving their interests, the CCP's interests?
Well, firstly, yes, those two books are about the status of Tibet, its historical status, its present status, and the rights of the Tibetan people. And part of it is a response to or a correction of the false narratives of the PRC. In fact, the PRC's narrative on Tibet's history has been fairly consistent through the years. As you know, they claim that Tibet has always been a part of China, or at least since ancient times. And I suppose the only change that there has been in the narrative is that they used to say that Tibet had been part of China already since Songtsen Gampo's wedding to a Chinese princess, but they have modified that, and now, because it is a ridiculous argument, they now claim that Tibet really became an integral part of China since the Yuan dynasty. And that, of course, is in the 13th century, so that is much later. But that argument also is wrong. Tibetans had a relationship with the Mongols, and the Mongols had a huge empire that stretched from the Pacific coast all the way to Eastern Europe. And Tibet was, one could say, a part of that enormous empire, but in no way part of China at that time. And so how has that narrative from China helped them? I think, especially in the last 20 or so years, or maybe 30 years, China has been very successful in this propaganda. So much so that I think many people today are no longer quite sure whether Tibet was a part of China or not, and perhaps many, including government officials, assume that there's some truth in the Chinese narrative. And that puts Tibet at a big disadvantage, because if Tibet was for centuries part of China, then that changes the nature of the conflict and people's perception of it. And then they consider it an internal problem of China and not an international problem.
Okay, and talking about your foundation, your organization, Kreddha, which is dedicated to prevention and sustainable resolution of violent conflict between the population groups and government of state which they live. So according to your experiences, the huge amount of work that you do with your organization, and also with these experiences, what potential do you see in the middle way approach in resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict, which is still going on, and we didn't have our government didn't have any formal talk with the Chinese since 2010.
Yes.
So it's been a long years in between. So what do you see there?
I think two things. One, any conflict, including if one has a war, any conflict ends through negotiations, through discussions between the two sides. So definitely the approach for dialogue and negotiations is a correct one. At the same time, for negotiations to take place and for a solution to be found, both sides need to be willing to negotiate and to talk. And my impression is, and this is just my personal impression, is that the present regime in China, Xi Jinping's government and Xi Jinping himself, have no intentions to sincerely look for a middle way, to sincerely find a solution in which they have to give and take. I think they want a solution in which the Tibetan side gives up everything and Xi Jinping increases his control rather than reduces or devolves some control. So with the present regime in China, I'm not terribly hopeful. At the same time, I think everything changes, and sooner or later there will be an opportunity, a change, and hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later, while it is still possible to negotiate something really meaningful for the Tibetan people.
So you also have many years of experience in Tibet advocacy. I mean, with your help, many Tibetan community and organizations were able to reach out to different government and high officials, right, in the government. So with your close connection with Tibetan cause, do you see the need for Tibet advocacy to reposition or redirect in the coming years? And if yes, in what ways?
Well, I do. And I think it relates to your earlier question about the success of China's narrative and the propaganda around it. I think as long as many in the international community believe somehow that Tibet was part of China, advocacy for any kind of solution, a middle way solution, or there's people who want independence. Whatever the objective is, advocacy for that is going to be very difficult unless the Tibet movement is able to persuade the world through advocacy that the truth about the true narrative, if you like, or the true history, which is that Tibet was in fact never a part of China. This is what the research that we've been doing shows, that it was never a part of China and that it was independent at the time that it was invaded. And since I think everybody nowadays is very aware after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine that the invasion of one country of another, of its neighbor, is one of the most serious violations of international law, and that the international community is not allowed to recognize the annexation by the use of force. This is what the world needs to be convinced is the case of Tibet. Tibet was aggressed, was invaded against international law, and the international community, in other words, the various governments of the world, may not recognize Tibet as part of China and should adopt a non-recognition policy. And I think once that happens, then the possibilities of meaningful negotiations will be much higher.
Okay. So Michael, these are my questions for a short interview. So it was wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much for giving us the time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.